Hi, it's Dennis Daly. For many years, Sunday morning on CBS was dominated by the stories and good nature of Charles Kuralt. And when Kuralt retired, he turned the reins of the show over to another Charles, Charles Osgood, who has now himself retired. Here's an interview I did with Charles Osgood, I in Los Angeles, he at UPI, New York. I mentioned to him that we had both lived in D.C. at one time, but never crossed paths.
Yeah, I enjoyed living in Washington a long time. I was there for, I guess, 8 years, and then went to Hartford after that. But I for the classical music station there, WGMS.
Oh, sure.
And also was the announcer for the U.S. Army Band. At Fort Myer. That was my active duty.
A lot of young kids today, of course, radio is not. I mean, you can't even compare today in the 70s. But we were running those half-hour public affairs shows, Serenade in Blue that the Navy was doing,
right,
and the program, the Army and the Air Force, and people like Charles Hughes.
Yes, well, Charles, I knew Charles very well. He went to Fordham, as did I, and he was I guess 1 year ahead of me, but he worked at the radio station, WFUV, and that's how I ended up going to Washington. He had spent some time at WGMS.
Wow.
And I know that he was doing the same kind of thing for the Air Force that I was for the Army, but he was doing it, he was stationed, I think, up at Limestone, Maine, when he was in the Air Force. But he was still doing some radio shows.
Well, so people don't realize that with the military bands in Washington, so much music came out of there. I mean, known stars were coming in to do these public affairs shows, either as a tax write-off or whatever. There was some great music being generated in Washington. People forget that.
Remember, Eddie Fisher was the singer for the U.S. Army Band.
Right, I forgot.
And then after that, it was Steve Lawrence. So they've had not only good singing talent, also while I was there in the Army Band, George Shirley came along. At that time, it just shows you how times have changed. The very first African American to be in the United States Army Band or chorus was the singer George Shirley, who went on to have a very distinguished career at the Metropolitan Opera.
Wow!
And the reason that they always said, when they were auditioning black musicians, that a lot of talent there, but it hadn't gone to the right conservatories and all that kind of stuff. But George could do anything. I mean, every piece of music you could put up for him, he had a fabulous range and a great musicality about him. There was no way that you could, and it was way overdue anyway.
Charlie, off the record, how old are you?
I'm 66.
Oh, boy, wouldn't have known it. The reason I ask is at 52, it still amazes me that when we used to visit my cousins in Washington, D.C., I remember asking my dad what the sign whites only meant. Mm-hmm. And that's in our lifetime.
That's right.
And it's tough to tell people about that they just can't, relate to it.
And this is in the nation's capital, and of course in Virginia, which is where Fort Myer is, and there's no question but that there was still a lot of segregation around at that time, and the civil rights years, the years of Martin Luther King, the demonstrations and marches, and the civil rights laws didn't happen until 5 or 6 years after that.
Well, you remember that classic picture. If you can picture Capitol Hill on the back, I call it the backside, 6th and 7th Street East on Pennsylvania Avenue. There's a restaurant there named Mr. Henry's, I think. But that whole area, some of the worst slums in the U.S. were in the shadow of the Capitol building.
Yeah,
but on the backside.
It has not completely changed.
No, not at all. There's a little bit of a 60-cycle hum I'm hearing on your mic, but I think I can filter it out.
I'm hearing it also, but I don't think it's on my mic.
It may be that control board. I can fix it. This wonderful. I didn't think I liked digital editing. I love recording tape. But the new digital recorders we have, you can tell them to do anything. So I'll just take this out later. Don't worry about it.
Okay, I can't. There's nothing in this room that's making that noise, but I'm hearing it in my earphones.
You're not humming, are you?
Well, aside from that, that's actually, I just had lunch.
Did you know Tom Gager with ABC? Tom was an aficionado of the bands. The other thing I was going to say about Charlie Hughes is I did a recording session with him one time, and he was doing the booth for Brinkley's show.
Right.
And he was saying, "This week with David Brinkley." And I got him to say, "This week without David Brinkley," just to be funny. And when Brinkley retired, I had that cut of him running. I don't know whether he liked the fact I used it or not.
I haven't talked to Charlie in years, but we used to be really quite good friends.
Sweet guy.
Back when we were going to school. And the thing is, I was an enlisted man in my military duty, and Charles, who had successfully completed the ROTC program at Fordham, was an officer. He was a second lieutenant.
Are we okay?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Can you hear the noise that he's talking about? I'm talking to the technician here. We're only hearing this coming back. It must be something something between here and there, I guess.
Oh, well, okay. I've got my board turned off to you, so we'll live with it. It's not terrible. I shouldn't be such a perfectionist.
But am I hearing you over the telephone? I mean, I'm hearing you.
Well, you're just hearing me on the phone.
Oh, I see.
And they're just feeding me your mic.
I see.
So that way I'm not mixed in with it at all. Okay, Charlie, thanks for taking the time to talk to us. I moved to the West Coast a couple of years ago, and one of the reasons I moved to L.A. was to be closer to San Francisco. Anyone who has gone through or lived there hears you every hour doing the IDs on KCBS. Do you know they're still using you there?
I'm told that they are, and we refresh those every so often.
Well, they sound great.
And also, of course, we do the Osgood File broadcasts on KCBS four times a day.
How long have you been doing the Osgood File, and how long has it been that frequent every day?
I have been doing either the Osgood File or some other show just like the Osgood File, but with a different name, for about 35 years now.
Mm-hmm. Have you always done poetry?
Poetry sort of snuck in there along the line somewhere. It was never really my intention to do poetry, but when you're doing 4 different shows each day, sometimes you look for different ways of doing things. And I started doing that while I was working for the local radio station for WCBS Radio here in New York.
I must say that over the years, those of us who love broadcasting have a great affinity for CBS. I worked at an affiliate in southern Indiana for 10 years and got to know a lot of the people in New York. I guess I'm old enough to still have that slavish devotion to the Edward R. Murrow era, of whom I guess Dan Shore is about the only one left from there. But I've always thought that when it comes to news, and particularly gentle things, such as Charles Kuralt did over the years, you guys really know how to do it best.
I think that people have often said that it seems strange that CBS News had been able, over all those years, to come up with people like Walter Cronkite and Severide, Morrow. Bill Moyers was at CBS before he moved on to public television, and as you say, Kuralt, maybe Kuralt more than almost anybody. But then, and also Andy Rooney,
sure,
I don't know. It just seems that to work here and walk the halls during all of those years, but even still today, it is. They've been very fortunate, and I think part of it is that they have not insisted on one particular style. You did not have to have a certain kind of a voice or come from a certain part of the country. You didn't have to sound like a radio announcer, and I think as a consequence that they got people who had good experience as writers, good experience as journalists, and that was always given top priority.
Well, I don't know whether anyone listening can relate to this, but I'm hearing Alexander Kendrick and Hughes Rudd in my ear. And if you take 2 of those gentlemen, they had probably the least radio-voiced gift. People would say, you guys don't belong in broadcasting, but they were great.
Well, Alexander can't excuse to talk sort of like that, and Hughes was so down home boy from Texas, and it showed up in things that he did. But those guys were 2 of the most erudite people that you would ever see.
Oh, I know, and I remember on Sundays it used to be the World This Week that Kendrick. You're right. He sounded like a gangster. Almost.
Well, he sounded as the voice sounded as if he might be typecast as a gangster. Yes. But he really knew his stuff. And of course, Hughes was one of the best writers that this business has ever seen. He was he was able to say things in a very sort of simple and direct and sometimes very funny way.
Let's talk about the human voice for a second. I don't want to sound like Marshall McLuhan saying the medium is the message, but if we listen to your vocal style, and we look at what you're doing in some ways as being almost the end of an era in a way. I mean, we still have Paul Harvey. Some of us have great memories of Arthur Godfrey. And no matter what you think of those guys, there's still something to be said for the power of the human voice. And for the most part, I don't hear it a lot anymore. I mean, I'm not enthralled by a lot of people. Maybe that's shallow of me, but I mean, that's where you excel.
I
It's
think
not
the
only your
voice
writing, it's the way you speak it.
in the radio days, and by the way, these are still the radio days. But I think before television came along, all you had was your voice, and so it was considered more important then. But even in those days, as we've said, I mean, people like Hughes and like Alex Kendrick and a lot of others that I could think of did not necessarily have the big pipes that you associate with radio broadcasters. And I think some of the people who did well in news in radio were people who had been in acting before. Who had I'm talking about people like Paul Harvey and people like Mike Wallace.
Oh, sure. People don't know Mike did a lot of TV drama, didn't he?
Yes, he did, and a lot of commercials as well. Mm-hmm. But I think the thing that Mike can do is he has a compelling way of expressing himself, and he can ad lib as well as anybody else in this business. So he's not somebody that sort of depends on a script to do it. And he can do everything that you need to do in this business. And at the age of 80, he's still doing it better than almost anybody.
Yeah, what amazes me, and maybe I'm not totally sounding self-serving here, but I'm a pretty good ad-libber. Sometimes I don't even write things down. But what amazes me is when you go to a stakeout, like I covered the end of the second Simpson trial, the people who were out there covering that trial for a year who couldn't do a live report after it was over without looking at their notes. Mm-hmm. There are a lot of talking heads out there, unfortunately, who can't ad-lib their way out of a paper sack, but they look nice.
Well, and of course, looking nice is important in television, and it's not important at all in radio. And that's why I've always thought of myself as a guy who had I have a face. I was born for radio. I was interested in radio long before television came along, and I still don't think of myself, although I do the Sunday morning broadcast for the television network. I still think of myself not as a TV guy who does some radio shows, but as a radio guy who does a television show.
Mm-hmm. This is 5 years now you've been doing this, right?
That's right. To me, that's amazing. It feels more like about 5 minutes.
How early do you have to get up? I don't mean to make the big point out of that, but I am not a morning person.
Well, people say, how early do you have to get up on Sunday morning? Because that thing goes on at 9 o'clock. On the East Coast, it goes on from 9 to 10:30. But actually, Sunday morning is my morning to sleep in. I sleep until 5 o'clock on Sunday morning. And during the rest of the week, I get up at 2:30 in the morning. And that's because the short-form broadcasts that I do on radio really do have to be written, because they have to be produced and they last a given length of time, and so you have to decide in advance what you're going to do and start writing it in advance. So that requires going in early. So my routine is to set the alarm for 2:30 each morning, which is, I don't know if you ever have worked a morning shift, but
oh, yes.
I can assure you that the 2:30 in the morning has nothing to do with the morning at all. It's the middle of the night.
No, and it's tough to convince people who will call you at some odd hour that it's the middle of the night to you. People who've never worked shift or odd work just don't understand how precious your sleep is.
Well, if they call you at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I mean, that seems a reasonable thing to do. In fact, it seems reasonable to most people to call you at 9 or 10 o'clock at night. But for me, that's right in the middle of the sleep period.
I hope you take your phone off the hook.
Well, you can't really. I mean, we have 5 kids and friends, and people need to get in touch with us, and so I don't take the phone off the hook. But I mean, most of the people who know us well also know that I'm an early to bed guy.
You have a life outside of broadcasting?
Yes, actually. Yes, amazingly enough, even though I'm working 6 days a week now, it still is possible, even on the schedule, to have a normal human life. So as I say, my wife and I have 5 kids, and we take vacations, and we do things that regular people do. In fact, the only way in which our life is any different is that I have this outrageous schedule, and so I'm up and out before anybody else cracks an eye in the morning.
What are your memories of Charles Kuralt, and how did you feel about stepping into his shoes?
Well, all of my memories of Kuralt are of great respect and affection. He was a hero of mine before I ever met him, before I came to work for CBS. In fact, what I really wanted to do when I first came to work here, and I actually proposed this, and now I understand perhaps it was a little too much to ask, but I wanted to just spend a few weeks just following him around, seeing how he did what he did. Because Charles had such a marvelous way with words, a marvelous way of talking into a microphone and into a camera. And, you know, they say what works best in broadcasting is when it is most genuine, when what you see is what you get. And somehow Charles was able to distill that and be even more of himself on camera and on mic than he was otherwise. But that was the person. That was the pure Kuralt that you were getting. And he had a wonderful way of putting words together. He was also a tremendous television performer. I mean, he knew how to move on camera, to change shots. He produced his own pieces. Most reporters, when they go out in the field on the network level, have got a producer with them. And he never did. He acted as his own producer, and he traveled around with a wonderful camera crew, Izzy Bleckman and his people, and they worked as a great team. And all of those years of the pieces on the road that he did, I mean, he set a standard and showed the rest of us how to do it, and nobody has ever done it as well.
Well, you look at the things he did, but also, you know, he was I was going to say good soldier, but as if it were some negative assignments he got. But I remember back in the 70s, he was doing a daily medical feature on CBS Radio. Mm-hmm. And that's a tough assignment to make it seem interesting. But, you know, I sat there and listened.
Well, I think Charles could read the telephone book and make it sound interesting. He had that, you know, that wonderful way of talking. But in fact, I think what made Charles work on radio and on television is that it was not just a question of words, you know, coming out of his, you know, off the page and out of his mouth. He engaged all of himself, that is to say, his brain and his heart, and you knew instinctively as a listener that somebody, a real person, was talking to you, and it made you want to listen. And
he made it look easy. I mean, I'm sure you listen to what he said and the literacy of it, that he, you know, labored over what he wrote. But still, it seems so ad-libbed. It seems so just off the cuff.
Yes, but, you know, they say, the great ones, they used to say of Joe DiMaggio that, he makes everything look so easy. And DiMaggio, I heard, after his death, I heard an interview that had been done by Bob Lipsyte when he was doing pieces for Sunday Morning, and he interviewed DiMaggio. And DiMaggio said, people always tell me that I make it look so easy, and it must be so easy for me. And he said, it's not easy. It's never been easy. He said, it may look easy, but it's not. He said, you know, I always I'm trying very hard and trying to do on each play. I'm trying to do the best that I can, and I give it as much effort as I have to make sure that I'm there when the ball gets there. To make sure that I'm focusing on the ball, doing all the things you're supposed to do to hit a baseball. So I think that effortlessness is a trick in a way. I mean, it looks easy, but I know because I know Charles and did see him at work for many years that he labored over it, and also that he was not relaxed going on the air. He was not thinking so much about relaxing himself as he was thinking about the audience and wanting the audience to be engaged. But in fact, at the beginning of the broadcast, the beginning of Sunday morning, I'm usually standing by a little plexiglass tower there that has what we call the index. It's got the subjects and the titles of the pieces that are going to be on the air that morning. And I was told that we usually tape that part, and most of the time we still do when we've got time to tape it. And the reason was that Charles wanted to tape that because he was afraid that he might fall down. He was actually afraid that he might pass out. He was nervous.
Wow.
And that's I know that's very hard to believe if you had seen him doing it all those years, but the fact is that he would get a little woozy sometimes and under the pressure of it all.
Isn't that amazing? You hear those stories about Red Skelton sometimes getting ill before his television show because he was just terrified. And yet when the music starts and the show must go on.
Yes, I'm sure it was somewhere this side of terror in the case of Charles, but first of all, he knew that the tape technology was such that it was the same thing as being live, and
sure.
he wanted to be sure that it went the way it was supposed to. But also he did feel some anxiety about it, and because you are standing up and not sitting, I think he preferred to do those things where he's sitting on the stool. I think he felt a little more stable there.
I cannot remember the circumstances, and I don't mean to pry here, but was his death unexpected? And what I'm trying to ask, I guess, is when you stepped into that, was there some thought that this was going to happen?
Not at all. No, not at all. I think Charles was tired. He was not in very good physical condition. You know, he smoked too much and he weighed too much, and I heard Diane Sawyer saying one time that when Charles died, he was going to leave his body to science fiction. But in fact, what he died of was lupus, and a lupus that was not diagnosed until just a couple of days before he died. He was feeling. He was just exhausted. Although I think that had something to do with him wanting to stop doing Sunday morning. He had not really done the traveling, the on the road thing. He had not done that for almost 20 years. He did occasional pieces from the road. Most of those travel pieces that you see are things that he had recorded back before Sunday morning began. Mm-hmm. But I think that he was not in very, and because he smoked so much, and because he had it was sort of taxing on his system, taxing on his cardiovascular system, and he was often short of breath we usually prepare the broadcast in the CBS newsroom and then move on to whatever the studio is where the broadcast originates. And Charles, it was not easy for Charles to move around. He was a year younger than me, and yet you could see that he was having more difficulty, moving around. But anyway, he did not quit for reasons of health. He wanted to spend some time. He wanted to go to some of these places that he had been while doing the on the road broadcast and actually spend some time with the people. And he always had said that he thought that he was kind of fortunate in this business because when some reporters go in to cover a story, sometimes they're not entirely sure that they'd be welcomed back. But he was always invited to come back because of the kind of man that he was. People made friends with him and always were glad to see him. So he wanted to go back to some of these places in America that he had reported on, but could only stay briefly and really spend a few weeks there.
Well, one of the things, being a child of rural America, that I was always impressed with is that a reporter like Charles Kuralt, with fewer ethics, or is it less? I don't know whether ethics is a collective noun, would have gone into some of these really rural situations and actually made fun of them, where he gave dignity to every place he went. I mean, I really enjoyed the fact that even if he came across a real character somewhere who was completely out of touch with society, Charlie never made light of that.
No, in fact, I think most of America assumed, Charles did come from North Carolina, and there was a lot of this music of North Carolina in his way of speaking. But a lot of people assumed that he lived there in the piney woods someplace, and that he would come out of his cabin every so often and get into the van and travel around. The fact is that he lived in New York City. He lived in Greenwich Village, and he stayed there as often as he could. He went around and he did travel quite a bit. But I think Charles was very comfortable in New York. He too. We're talking about how really sophisticated somebody like Hughes Rudd was. Well, Charles was also a sophisticated man, and he had done his share of standard news reporting. He had met presidents and kings, and he had that common touch, which he brought with him everywhere he went, and he treated everybody alike. And I think that's one of the things that we really respected most about him.
Well, and we forget, as I was talking about his medical reports, that not everything he did was sidebars. I mean, I can remember political conventions and other things where he was called upon to do regular reporting and did that extremely well.
Yes, he did. And he brought that touch to it,
Sure.
that we all wish we had.
How long did he do the Sunday show?
Well, the broadcast is now 20 years old, and he did the first 15 years, and I've done the last 5. But I think that the reputation that the broadcast has, and the devoted audience that it has, and all of the what makes Sunday morning be what it is what he set down. He and Shad Northshield, who was the first producer, that this broadcast was going to be, and it's supposed to be like a Sunday newspaper. Mm-hmm. And the pieces are longer and more measured and more thoughtful, and we try to cover subjects that during the week the television just doesn't have any time for. So we do pieces about the arts, and instead of, I think the way I like to think of it is that instead of finding some terrible thing somewhere that has happened or that somebody has done and wagging our fingers at them and saying, isn't that awful, and doesn't it make you sick to your stomach, what he liked to do is to point to somebody who was doing something wonderful, something amusing or something to help people, and say, look at that man, isn't that terrific? Or look at that woman, isn't that, it makes you proud to be an American. And I think that was pretty much in the background of every piece that he did.
How do you get your story ideas? I mean, on the daily 4 that you have to do, you've got the wire service and your affiliates and everything, but I remember somebody telling me that people would call Lowell Thomas, the mayor of a small town, would say, hey, we've got something really neat happening. Do you find stories sometimes being offered that way? People?
Oh, sure.
Because you come up with these really arcane things sometimes.
Well, the daily pieces that we do for radio, because there are 4 of them, you have quite a lot of opportunity to do stories and do things that are a little different. If you're just doing one piece a week or something of that sort, it's a little more difficult. But we get tons of suggestions all the time. If you do a piece about somebody who is helping blind kids or something like that, if you do one story like that, then you'll get dozens of letters and suggestions from other people who are helping blind kids, and you can only, you want the pieces to be different, and so you can't always. But it's funny. But most of the pieces that he did, maybe even all the pieces that Charles did on the road, had never been done on network television before. In most cases, they had not been even on local television, and I think it's that in probably about half the time it hadn't even been reported at all in the local press. It hadn't even been recognized locally as something that you'd want to do a story about. Do you remember the story he did about the man in it was Minnesota or the Dakota someplace who was building a highway? Yes. I'd love to get a copy of that. This fellow spent the better part of his adult life flattening out and paving a road because, he couldn't get the county to build it or something? Yes, and he set himself out to do it. He wanted, how hard could it be, Yeah. so you're quite right. I think he had been working on that road for 23, 24 years at the time that Charles did the piece, and he still had a ways to go. But yes, I mean that once you find out about somebody like that, and Charles could tell that story so well. I mean, he would interview the man, but it would not be. You didn't have the sense of it was an interview. It was a conversation, and the fellow would tell you why he was doing it, and something can get to be kind of an obsession with you. I've started to do this thing, and this has become my life's work, and I'm going to finish it. I'm going to try to finish it anyway. And so, it's that kind of thing of a person showing some kind of passion about something. That's what that's what he looked for, rather than for somebody who was, had found a new way to make some money or something. It's too bad there's not the time and the money and the personnel and the inclination anymore to find 5 or 6 of those stories and follow up and see where those people are now, or if the guy ever finished his road or died. Well, we have done some of that. At Charles, we on the 20th anniversary broadcast, which we did. Earlier this year, we played back some of the pieces that we had done in the past, and the broadcast the weekend that Charles died. He died a couple of years ago on the 4th of July. Yeah. And he died on a Friday, and then 2 days later we had our broadcasts, and in the intervening time we put together a broadcast that was all about Kuralt and his his approach and the contribution that he had made to the Sunday morning broadcast. And I think, I think that he gave it enough momentum. That's why when I say he did the first 15, I've done the last 5. I think, the last 5 years, it can all be explained on the basis of momentum. We've just done what he told us to do, and we've done it for 5 more years. Still following orders. Yep. When he died that weekend, I wanted to pay tribute to him on the air, and I knew that somewhere in my archive I had a little 5-inch reel of tape of one of his shows done back in the 70s, and it was about time zones, which I love that kind of stuff. So I was determined to find it. I tore up my apartment that weekend, and it was in the last box I looked in. Always. Took me 2 days. I wouldn't have done it for anyone less maybe, but it took me 2 days to get everything boxed back up. Do you know why it is that you always find something in the last place you look? No, I've always wondered that. I can tell you the reason for that. It's because when you find it, you stop.
Charlie, let's talk about the show and you. I think we both want to pay homage to Charles Kuralt, but there are other things to talk about. When you meet people, particularly young people, I have a fear that it's not going to be too long before young kids are not going to know the difference between fluff, tabloid, and journalism. What are your feelings on that? I mean, I run into more people who said, I saw this on, or I heard this on the internet, and they quote UPI, and we didn't have anything to do with it. I mean, it kind of scares me where all that's going.
Yeah, I think a lot of those distinctions are being blurred, but I think the problem is more serious than that. It's not just young kids outside the business that are not able to make that distinction. Sometimes it's grown-ups inside the business. They say, well, all you have to do is just, get some good-looking person in front of the camera and put the words there and let that person smile their way through and pleasantly through reading that copy, and that will pass. And you know better, I know better, and I think the American people really know better too. But a lot of people in television don't think that.
Well, I had a friend who told me that he had been sent out on a stakeout to stand in front of the house of Monica Lewinsky's lawyer to catch him as he left the house. Well, they knew the guy wasn't going to say anything, and my friend said, this is not a news story. The man gets up and goes to work. And I don't know how much money they spent with two producers and a cameraman and the talent out there, but they staked out this guy's house for 3 seconds of video of him going from his door to his car.
Of course, he might say something. You
that's true.
He might say, well...
might say, get out of my way.
Yeah, mostly that's what he did. And, we saw... Well, all of these stories, we become sort of obsessed with one story at a time. It's a little bit like what happens, in the book business today. It used to be that you'd see in the windows of a bookstore, and then if you went in, you would see on the shelves every conceivable kind of a book. And now, ordinarily, they'll take the number one bestseller and they'll put 100 copies of that number one bestseller in the window, because they say that's the book that people are talking about. It's the one that they're reading, and it's the one that they're going to buy. So I want them to know we've got it here in the store. And I think something of the same top 40 kind of mentality goes into picking the news. So, people are tuned in, and there's something that they want to find out about. What would it be? Well, it would be the thing that was in the headlines this morning, and particularly if it happens to have an aspect of the sensational about it. If it's about a murder or rape or has a salacious aspect to it, then you can be pretty sure that that's the thing that we'll go after. But I think the Sunday morning experience ought to, and it certainly has taught me a lot. I think it ought to teach other people in the business a lot too. And that is that if you try to really raise your sights and do reporting that is a little more thoughtful and talk about subjects that are not necessarily just one horror story after another, but things that are interesting and informative, and maybe, who knows, maybe even inspiring, that there's actually an audience for that too. And not everybody gets up early enough on a Sunday morning to see our broadcast. I wish they did, but what we do, competitively, we do very well on Sunday morning.
But don't you feel good about, one, not only having the time to do something long form, but also to be able to talk? You use the word uplifting, to be able to talk about religion or ethics, which is taboo to a lot of people.
Yes, of course. If you're talking about religion or politics, you also are likely to be stepping on some toes, and people will have different ideas, and people stay away from those subjects sometimes in conversation because they don't want to offend anybody. But we don't do them in an offensive way. And our audience, in fact, we are CBS News, and so we've got to do the breaking stories, and we've got to talk about those things that are of consequence that any journalist would pursue. But when we hear from our audience, it's not that why don't you do more stories about the O.J. Simpson trial or the Monica Lewinsky case? What they say is, everybody, those stories are being pretty well covered. Why don't you do something else? And they like us to do other things.
What are your favorite kinds of stories?
That's I ought to be able to snap back an answer to that. But I'm taking
too eclectic. You're too eclectic to answer that question.
Well, I can tell you what kind of stories I don't like. I mean, I really don't like the police blotter stories or stories that we have to report the catastrophes, and we have to report the big stories. I mean, obviously, we're going to talk about the wars and the bombings and the genocides and all of that. There's enough of that to you could fill a broadcast with it. But I also think that it's important for us to to let people know that that's not the whole story about everything that's going on. That there are people doing wonderful things, and that life is not one tragedy or one catastrophe after another. It's there are also things that are beautiful, and that are motivated not by hate but by love and by in the pursuit of beauty. The very favorite part of our broadcast, and everybody tells me this, is, you know what part I like best? And I'll say, let me guess. How about the nature scene at the end? They say, that's right. How did you know that? The fact is that everybody likes that. And we have had meetings where people would say, television executives would say, you're not doing anything there. You're just, you're just watching elk. They're standing there and occasionally bugling, or you're looking at some seals playing around, or some whales, or some birds. We're especially fond of birds on Sunday morning.
Well, nobody's jerking the camera around. I mean, it just doesn't look right. There's not enough flash and trash.
And there's no music playing in the background. I'm not reciting poetry in the background. There's not there are no sound effects. The only sounds you hear are the ones that are actually being made by the wind blowing through the trees or the waterfall or whatever it is that you're looking at. And yet, even though everybody says they love that, and people will say, can I get some of those things on tape and all of that, the fact is that imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, and nobody has tried to imitate us in that regard. And I don't understand why, since that has worked so well for us. But and on the other hand, I'm glad they don't, because that's a kind of exclusive that we have.
I don't know whether this was a joke or a comedy routine, but somebody suggested with the proliferation of cable channels that there be one called the Fish Tank Channel, and all it would be was a camera shot of a fish tank, so you can just sit there and just chill out on fish. Charlie, one final question, and I know you got to get to bed. Did you know Edward P. Morgan in Washington?
Yes, I did. I used to work for ABC. Mm-hmm. For a time, I did a broadcast called Flair Reports, which became
Dirk
ABC
Fredericks
Reports.
And Joel Krager?
Well,
they were out of New York, I think.
Yes, I think so. But occasionally, Edward P. Morgan did a broadcast that was sponsored by the
AFL-CIO.
Yep, that's right. And Frank Harden of the morning team of Harden and Weaver was the announcer on that broadcast for years and years, and he'd say, I don't know,
it was the 13.5 million Americans who bring, long, I hate to keep talking over you, but anyway, sometime off the air I'll tell you my story about Morgan. But the reason I ask is I was in Washington as a 17-year-old, and Edward P. Morgan had me in the studio 3 days. And I asked him, I said, Mr. Morgan, I want to be a correspondent. What should I do to learn all about radio? And his answer to me was, don't learn all about radio, learn all about the world. Mm-hmm. And I just wondered what you would say to students who see where broadcasting is going and wonder if radio is going to last forever, who really want to get into this business. Well, what would you say to them?
Well, I certainly have said to my own children, and I would say to young people who ask me, I did not major in communication arts. I did not major in journalism, and I didn't major in broadcasting, although all of those things were possible majors at Fordham when I went there. I think that a liberal arts background is the best that you can get. And if you focus on broadcasting as a subject, you're going to find out that the things that you learn how to do are probably going to be obsolete in 2 weeks. It's not a question. The idea of camera technique or mic technique or tape editing. I mean, all of these things. They didn't have tape when I started doing this. In fact, I think the technology will continue to change, and that's not what you have to learn. What you have to learn is how to think, and for that, a liberal arts background. Study the humanities, learn about those things that reflect the human condition. Learn how to think and learn how to care and to feel about the things that go on, and then you can the other stuff you can learn more easily.
Well, Charlie, for those of us who love the sound of the human voice and a literate turn of phrase, you have brought us an awful lot of joy over the years, and keep going.
Thank you, Dennis, and it's been a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you very much. I hope I didn't keep you too long.
No, it's just fine. I know that you're going to want to edit this down for sure.
Well, no, I'm going to use most of it. My interview show's got about 38 minutes in it. So.
Well, I think we took just about 38 minutes. We started about 2:30, and it's about.
No, it's been a pleasure to cross paths with you, and maybe we can meet face to face sometime.
I would enjoy that.
And thank the engineers.
Okay, I surely will. And nice talking with you, and I hope we do have a chance to meet.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks, Charles.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
One of the great, quiet, articulate journalists of television and radio, Charles Osgood. I'm Dennis Daly.